Hey everybody, this video is called The Healing of Naaman, and tonight we're going to continue our pass-through study here in the book of 2 Kings, chapter 5, where we're going to be looking at a leper coming to Elisha. So chapter 5, the opening verse 1 says, "Now Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great and honorable man in the eyes of his master, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was also a mighty man of valor, but a leper." So Naaman was actually a very common name at this time period in the area of Syria, in ancient Syria, and it meant to be gracious or fair. And he was the supreme commander over the army of Syria, and he was a great man at the time with a very high social standing and position. And we see that he is an honorable man, highly regarded by the king of Syria, as he held many military victories. And this Naaman guy, he was a man of valor. He wasn't just, victorious, but he had great wealth and courageous. He was a courageous warrior. And despite these wonderful things in his life, there was something in his life that he struggled with that was actually life-threatening. And we see that he suffers from leprosy, which was a very serious skin disease at this time period. And the king of Syria was either Ben-Hadad the first or second, but Naaman's military success was attributable to the God of Israel, who is sovereign over all the nations, as seen in Isaiah chapter 10 verse 13 and Amos chapter 9 verse 12. And authors like Gideon in Judges chapter 6 verse 12, Jephthah in Judges 11 verse 1, David in 1 Samuel 16:18, Jeroboam in 1 Kings 11:28, and Eliada later on in 2 Chronicles 17:17. They're all different people in the Old Testament that are given this title of man of valor. And what is interesting here is Naaman was not an Israelite. He was not Jewish. He was only a Gentile. So he was the only Gentile to be given in the scriptures this title of man of valor. And so back to where we were looking at with the skin disease called leprosy. At this time, it was incurable, and it was something that would result in a very slow and painful death. And leprosy, it would start out as small red spots that would grow bigger, and then they would turn white with scaly appearance. And then it was something that would spread over the entire body. It would cause people to lose their hair, and they would lose their hair from their head, and their eyebrows hair would even come out. And as it developed, you would start seeing like your toenails and fingernails falling off and becoming loose. And the joints of the fingers and the toes would begin to rot and fall off piece by piece. So that's just a feel of what leprosy was at this time. The gums shrunk and they could not hold teeth anymore. And leprosy kept eating away at the face until literally the nose, the palate, the palate, and even the eyes rotted, and the victim would waste away unto death. In verse 2 and 3, it says, "And the Syrians had gone out on raids and had brought back captive a young girl from the land of Israel. She waited on Naaman's wife. Then she said to her mistress, 'If only my master were the prophet who is in Samaria, for he would heal him of his leprosy.'" So verses 2 and 3 here, we see that Naaman led the Syrian army in quick penetrations across the Israel border. And on one of his raids, we see that he captures a young Israelite girl who's used as a servant by him, who ultimately told him about the prophet Elisha. And Elisha maintained a residence within the city of Samaria. And God allowed the tragedy of the girl's captivity to accomplish a greater good here. And she illustrated the mysterious ways that God works, and that this young girl, she was an outstanding example that we find of a faithful witness given the horrific circumstance that she's in. In verse 4 through 7, it says, And Naaman went in and told his master, saying, Thus and thus said the girl who is from the land of Israel. Then the king of Syria said, Go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel. So he departed and took with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. And he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which said, Now be advised when this letter comes to you, that I have sent Naaman my servant to you, that you may heal him of his leprosy. And it happened, when the king of Israel read the letter, that he tore his clothes and said, Am I God to kill or make alive, that this man sends a man to me to heal him of his leprosy? Therefore please consider and see how he seeks a quarrel with me. So when you go through the book of 2 Kings here, one thing you must understand is that this book is not necessarily chronologically. It's not arranged chronologically, as this probably occurred during a time of the lowered tension between Israel and Syria. And we see that they bring, monetary means, 10 talents of silver and 6,000 shekels of gold. And that's about 150 pounds of gold. And tearing of the clothes was very common in the Old Testament, as we see, and it was to show a sign of grief or distress, as we saw even just a couple weeks ago back in 1 Kings chapter 21 verse 27. And Jehoram thought that Ben-Hadad expected him to cure Naaman's leprosy, and since Jehoram knew that this was impossible, he thought that he was doomed that he was going to have a major battle with the Syrians. And when Elisha heard of Jehoram's distress, he told the king to send Naaman to him for healing. In verse 8 and 9 says, And so it was, when Elisha the man of God heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, that he sent to the king, saying, Why have you torn your clothes? Please let me come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. Then Naaman went with his horses and chariot, and he stood at the door of Elisha's house. So it's as Elisha gave the king of Israel a gentle rebuke, as Elisha came to his palace. And Naaman has to leave the palace to know that there was a prophet in Israel. In verse 10 through 12 says, And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored to you, and you shall be clean. But Naaman became furious, and he went away and said, Indeed, I said to myself, he will surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, and wave his hand over the place and heal the leprosy. Are not the Abana and the Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in rage. So we see that Naaman, who came to seek healing, he became angry at Elisha, as kings were generally honored. And we see that Elisha sent this messenger to Naaman with the instructions for healing. And Naaman was angry that he expected a personal cleansing ceremony from the actual prophet himself. And, it kind of reminds me of maybe when you go to the doctors and you expect to see the doctor, but you don't see the doctor, you see the nurse practitioner or physician assistant. And, it can be kind of disappointing sometimes because you think something is serious. And, I'm not saying that they're not credited to do that type of work, but, we always seem to think of a more formal way in our dealings. And the Abana River, known today as the Barada, began in the Lebanon mountains, and it flowed to Damascus. And its clear water produced orchards and gardens. And the Pharpar, however that river is called, flowed east of Mount Hermon to the south of Damascus. And if Naaman needed to wash in a river, those 2 rivers were superior to the muddy Jordan. And however, it was obedience to God's word that was the issue here, not the quality of the water. And Naaman wanted God to do things his way, and he got offended when God did not. And it's kind of reminds me of today, how many people expect God to move, but they want God to move under their expectations and their purposes. And verse 13 says, and his servants came near and spoke to him and said, my father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you not have done it? How much more then when he says to you, wash, be clean, or wash and be clean. So the term father was not usually employed by servants to their masters. And so the term of the use here may indicate something of a warmness that the servants felt for Naaman. And his servants pointed to Naaman that he had been willing to do anything, no matter how hard, to be cured. And he should even be more willing. They're forced to do something as easy as washing up in the muddy river. And verse 14 says, so he went down and dipped 7 times in the Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. So verse 14, flesh of a little child, that description might seem a little odd to you, but it indicates that ancient leprosy was a disease of the skin, distinct from what we see today with modern leprosy, a disease primarily of the nerves. And make sure you don't never get confused about leprosy when you read leprosy in the Bible versus what you might see in some parts, in different continents. And Naaman did exactly as Elisha told him to do, and we see that he is healed. And pride and evil questioning would have cost him his healing if he did not overcome them. And we struggle with the same thing. And sometimes our prayers might not be answered right away because we are struggling with pride and evil questioning. Would God really do that? Should I even be praying for this? So on and so forth. Verse 15 or 16. Make sure I read the right chapters. I just flipped my page here. It says, and he returned to the man of God, he and all his aides, and came and stood before him. And he said, indeed, now I know that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. Now therefore, please take a gift from your servant. But he said, as the Lord lives, before whom I stand, I will receive nothing. And he urged him to take it, but he refused. So upon his healing, we see that Naaman returned from the Jordan River to Elisha's house in Samaria, and approximately a 25-mile to give confession of his new belief. And Naaman confessed that there was only the one true God of Israel, Israel's God, the Lord. And in saying this, Naaman was putting to shame the Israelites who continued to blaspheme, believe that the Lord and Baal were gods, as seen back a few weeks ago, back in 1 Kings 18:21. And to show that he wasn't driven by mercenary motives of pagan priests and prophets, Elisha, though accepting gifts on other occasions, such as the last chapter, verse 42, declined them to hear so that the Syrians could see the honor of God only. And it wasn't just the healing of Naaman of this that persuaded Naaman of this. It was the healing connected with the word of the prophet. And verse 17 through 19 says, so Naaman said, then if not, please let your servant be given 2 mule loads of earth, for your servant will no longer offer either burnt offering or sacrifice to other gods, but to the Lord. Yet in this thing, may the Lord pardon your servant. When my master goes into the temple of Rimmon to worship there, and he leans on my hand, and I bow down in the temple of Rimmon. When I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord please pardon your servant in this thing. Then he said to him, go in peace. So he departed from him a short distance. So in the ancient Near East, it was thought that a god could be worshipped only on the soil of the nations to which it was bound. And therefore Naaman wanted a load of Israelite soil on to which to make his burnt offerings and his sacrifices to the Lord when he returned back to Syria and Damascus. And this request confirmed how Naaman had changed, whereas he had previously disdained Israel's river, and now he wanted to take a pile of Israelite soil back with him to home. And Ramon means pomegranate, and it was a parody of the Syrian deity Hadad, whom the Assyrians named Rainan, meaning thunderer. And Hadad was the storm god that was usually identified with the Canaanite god Baal. And as an aid to Syria's king, Naaman's duty demanded that he accompany the king to religious services at the temple of Ramon in Damascus. And we see that Naaman requested that the Lord forgive this outward compromise of his true faith and his commitment to the Lord. In verse 20 through 24 says, "But Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, said, 'Look, my master has spared Naaman this Syrian, while not receiving from his hands what he brought. But as the Lord lives, I will run after him and take something from him.' So Gehazi purchased Naaman, and when Naaman saw him running after him, he got down from the chariot to meet him and said, 'Is all well?' And he said, 'All is well, my master has sent me, saying, Indeed, just now 2 young men of the sons of the prophets have come to me from the mountains of Ephraim. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 changes of garments.' So Naaman said, 'Please take 2 talents. And he urged them and bound 2 talents of silver in 2 bags with 2 changes of garments and handed them to 2 of his servants, and they carried them on ahead of him. And when he came into the citadel, he took them from their hand, and he stored away in the house. And when the men let go, and he then let the men go, and they departed." So as Gehazi heard of Naaman and Elisha speak, he was shocked that his master would refuse to take anything from such a wealthy, influential, and grateful man. And he figured someone would benefit from such an opportunity, and he took the initiative to run after Naaman and take something from him. And Gehazi thought that Elisha deserved a reward, and he also became exactly what Elisha avoided, becoming a taker. And you probably know people that are always on the take. And Gehazi was the character of selfish gain. And 2 talents of silver was approximately 150 pounds of silver. And Gehazi probably thought that God was working his journey as he asked for a talent of silver, and Naaman happily gave him 2 talents. And Gehazi knew that he did wrong, as he intentionally hid them away from Elisha. In verse 25 through 27, to wrap up the chapter here today, says, "Now he went in and stood before his master Elisha and said to him, 'Where did you go, Gehazi?' And he said, 'Your servant did not go anywhere.' Then he said to him, 'Did not my heart go with you when the man turned back from his chariot to meet you? Is it time to receive money and to receive clothing, olive groves and vineyards, sheep, oxen, males and female servants? Therefore the leprosy of Naaman shall cling to you and your descendants forever.' And he went out from his presence, leprous, as white as snow." And it's actually kind of interesting that, snow is in this verse, because when you look out my window right now, it's actually snowing here. But Elisha knew that Gehazi had lied. And though his body did not move, Elisha's mind had seen all that had transpired between Gehazi and Naaman. And Gehazi's greed had cast a shadow over the integrity of Elisha's prophetic office. And this made him no better in the people thinking than Israel's false prophets who prophesied for material gain, the very thing that he wanted to avoid. And Gehazi betrayed a lack of faith in the Lord's ability to provide. And as a result, we see that the prophet Elisha condemned Gehazi and his descendants to suffer Naaman's skin disease forever. And, so he does this wicked act, and what Naaman was healed of, now the judgment would be that this guy's going to have this the rest of his days. And the punishment was a twist for Gehazi, who had gone to take something from Naaman, but what he received was Naaman's disease. And all Gehazi's attempts to cover his sin failed. And though Gehazi wanted money, clothing, olive grapes, vineyards, sheep, oxen, and servants, he did not bring all of these things home. And Elisha exposed his greedy heart. And so we see here of a pagan who by an act of faith is cured of this very serious disease at this time of leprosy, while an Israelite who by an act of dishonor is cursed by it. So to wrap up this video for today, we look at Naaman coming to Elisha with the problem of leprosy, and we saw the testimony of his servant girl. And Naaman sought for healing from the leprosy and went to Elisha's house. And we see that when Elisha provided feedback on how to be healed, that Naaman did not receive it well. He wanted to hear from Elisha himself. He didn't want to hear through a spokesperson. And we saw that Naaman's servants provided good advice, and that Naaman was ultimately healed in the chapter. And we saw that Naaman offered to reward Elisha, but the prophet rejected it. And this passage, when we think of lepers, we might think of a New Testament passage, and I'm going to actually read it here in Luke chapter 17. So Luke chapter 17 verse 12. It reminds me of how when Jesus did the miracle with the 10 lepers, only one came with gratitude to him. So actually we'll start with verse 11 in Luke 17. Now it happened as he went to Jerusalem that he passed through the midst of Samaria and Galilee. Then as he entered a certain village, there met him 10 men who were lepers, who stood afar off, and they lifted up their voices and said, Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. So when he saw them, he said to them, Go show yourselves to the priests. So it was that they went, that they were cleansed. And one of them, when he saw that he was healed, returned, and with a loud voice glorified God, and fell down at his face, or on his face, at his feet, giving him thanks. And he was a Samaritan. So Jesus answered and said, Were not 10 cleansed, but where are the 9? And I love that passage here in the gospel according to Luke, because Jesus calls out just how how we can have a lack in gratitude. And Naaman, he displayed gratitude, and we see that the foreigner, we see that he was also a foreigner, like this one thankful leper in Luke chapter 17. And we saw Naaman's new faith, and then how Gehazi followed after him. And we see the reward of Gehazi, the ending of his reward and his fate. And that's going to wrap up this video for today. We are 20% of the way through this study through 2 Kings. And we'll see you next on Friday as we're going to look at God's protection of Elisha. So I hope you have a great rest of your evening and week. God bless. And if you live up north here, be safe with the snow.